Rear Reflection by a matte painter. He had fit right in at Amalgamated Consulting Organization, but was not surprised that it was just a cover for what it really was. Dr. Jeffrey Berly had known all along that it was a front, but for what he had no clue till he was asked to join either. The ACO's true name was Amalgamated Contact Organization. It was a joint multi-government military organization that wanted to make contact with any peaceful alien civilization. Berly never really put much thought into UFOs. He had seen many amazing things, from time travel to seeing into other dimensions, but had never seen an alien before, and now he was the second in command in a multi-government organization looking for them. Colonel Steve Johnston had moved his office into Colonel Michael Hamilton III's old office, and he inherited Steve's. He only had one office before, mostly a desk in corner of a lab was all he needed. In his head, he heard his artificial intelligence assistant Terry say, "Your team will need you at the main lab at 1400 hours, and Ginny and you are to be at Steve's and Susie's at 1800, for dinner." "Thank you, I had forgotten about dinner." His mind was on work. He was close to figuring out a way to save his friend Hamilton. He and his secretary Tina Bellamy were prisoners, lost, or stuck in another dimension. They had a way into that dimension but were shut down by the president. They had been gone for 18 months now, and he wanted his friend back. The president may have shut them down with the mirror bridge to save them, but they didn't know he was about to make a breakthrough in the work he was doing in dimensional shift for use in space travel. He was sure that in a day or two he will again be able to open a doorway, and nothing was going to stop him from finding Hamilton. He was going to tell the other at dinner tonight, knowing that was going to make Steve mad, but he thought he could trust him not to try stopping him. "Terry, is Steve in his office?" he thought. Ginny had told me he would be out today for a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of the ACO. He was glad he didn't have to be part of that circus. Steve had told him about it, but he had forgotten about it not having to go. Ginny asked if you would like a cup of coffee. He nodded his head and thought, "Sure, but how did she ask you?" "We girls text all the time." He thought there was a sense of surprise. That he had not already known that. "I may not have a body, but I can still get around." There was a knock on the door, and Ginny walked in with 2 cups of coffee. "Terry said you need a distraction." She smiled. "She did she?" He looked up as if talking to the sky. "Maybe I should just shut her off and stop her meddling in my mind." "Oh, come on Doc, she's only thinking of your health, after all." "I know my dear. Hamilton and Tina have been on my mind." "Well, they must have been great people for you to worry so much about them." Michael was a good friend, now Tina was just Tina. She was always a bit reserved around anyone. It was as if she was studying everyone that came to the office, but really it was her job to keep Michael safe when at the office. "I only knew her a few hours and never met the colonel. That was my first day at ACO, and had no clue of either at that time." He smiled. "You know, when I found out about it, but I had known there was something going on, even then." Michael had a way of finding funding, most came from the Air Force, and he was a colonel, after all. "I'll pick you up at 5:30, don't make me come looking for you in near orbit." She smiled at him. She stood up, back to work and out the door, she went. He went back to the file he was reading on his computer. It was about a couple that had been abducted from a ship in the Mediterranean, near the Isles of Scamboil. They had sailed near to watch the volcano erupt at night. A ball of light came from it and hovered over their sailboat. There were 2 witnesses, on another ship not far off. They said a light flashed down so bright that they could not look at it long. When it went dark again, the couple was gone. He found many of the reports that talked about a lot of ideas that he had been thinking about. Like the light being used in teleporting, or the aliens passing through walls. He just didn't understand why an organization wanting contact with aliens be so involved in cover UPS. What they were covering up was not sighting, but the fact that some aliens were not all that friendly. This reminded him of the massive motion in the other dimension, which turned out to be some kind of alien forms moving about. They all thought it was an invasion force of some kind. They were building a huge mirror bridge, and this did worry him. The president was right, they didn't know if it was coming here, but he thought if they could save Hamilton he would know what was going on there. You know, that I do not approve of this endeavor, right? He heard Terry in his head. Yes, but I'm doing what I think is right, even if it's wrong. He was determined. Susie had done a great job on dinner. She may have been 6 months pregnant, but that didn't stop her. Steve and Berly went to the living room as the ladies stayed in the dining room. They sat down as Berly said, "Can you shut down Kylie? I would like to talk privately." Steve looked at him hard and then said, "Kylie, would you please?" A moment later he looked back at Berly. "What's the trouble, Jeffrey?" He hardly used his first name. "I'm going after Hamilton, this Saturday. I'm surprised it's taken you 6 months to figure out how to. Susie and I have spoken a couple of times about this, and we both think that there is no way you are going alone." Berly cocked his head to the side a little. "I will not put Susie, or you in the middle of this. I had nothing to do with Hamilton, but Tina, now that's on me. I can understand how you feel. He was kind of my friend too, but like I said, you are not going alone, and that's it, or I'll lock up your lab." Steve had the power to do that, he thought, but was sure he won't. Now putting a few guards on it was not beyond him. "Susie, and you have to think of your baby. Once there, I have no clue what will happen. I may never come back. I'm not talking about us going." Steve smiled, and pointed at the kitchen. "You not going anywhere without that young lady in there?" He was shocked. No way was he putting Ginny in harm's way. "What? No way she is going." Steve giggled. "She can kill you 3 ways," as she puts her lipstick on. "Look, if Terry can't go with you, you will need all the help you can get." True, he thought. "Okay, I admit, we don't have a clue if an AI can cross over, but Terry and I both believe that if she is shut down as I cross, she should be fine. I must say I'm not pleased that you're making me take Ginny, even if she wants to go. I'm not. She is. She told me she would personally call the president, and put a stop to you. She is his cousin or niece or something anyways." Oh, that's really great, he thought, but there was no way he was going to pass up this chance. The rest of the evening was uneventful, but as Ginny drove him home, he asked what she thought she was up to. She said that there was no way she was going to let him out of her sight, so to just stop complaining about it. When they got to his house, he was about to get out when she said, smiling, "Hold on a minute, you mean to tell me you're not going to invite me in for a drink?" He smiled. "If only you weren't teasing an old man." He opened the car door. "A drink may just get you some teasing." She shut off the car. It had been the best 2 days of his life, he thought, as he sat on the porch sipping his coffee. Susie and Steve were to meet them at the lab at about 10, so he let Ginny sleep in. He wondered when she began to like him in that way. He had only been teasing her, never thinking it would end up with her in his bed. Whatever the reason, he was happy about that for sure. Ginny walked out wearing one of his shirts. "You need to get moving if we are going to make it on time." She sat down. "Like you're ready." He smiled, looking at her bare legs. "I'm fashionable in any dimension, I'll have you know." "That, my dear, I'm sure you are," he said as she gave him a kiss on his cheek. They took a little longer than they should getting ready, but was soon on their way. Berly had never learned to drive, so had to have a driver to get him anywhere. He didn't mind this, it would have stopped him from thinking as he rode. When they got there, Ginny stopped him from getting out. "Look, I want you to know that no one put me up to this. I want to be near you and know that you are safe. The best way to do this is to be with you. I know that Terry is with you, but she can't fight for you as I can, and don't tell me you can fight, I know better." She was right, he had never been in a real fight, his whole life. He was not sure if he could hurt someone if he had to, let alone kill. He had no clue what he may have to face in the other dimension. More than likely they were not friendly, from what they saw from the drone. Did that have something to do with Hamilton being taken? Could it be for the information that he knew about UFOs? I know you're right, I do need you, but what happens if we can't come back? He asked her. At least I'll be with you. She smiled. That is if we even live. What we are about to try has never been tested, remember? Oh stop, but I have faith in you. She got out of the car. Susie and Steve were already there and had a bag for each of them. Susie spoke first. Put this stuff on, we don't have much time before the guards will make their rounds. I'll get your machine warmed up, Steve said. He was sitting at the computer that controlled the key systems. The lights came on in the lab, just outside of the control room. There was a pool of mercury, 20 feet round, and 3 feet deep. There was a platform about 25 feet above, that ran out over it. Steve had not been there in a while, so was really lost as to what to do other than turn on the lights. Berly kind of giggled, you should check on my work a little more often. You won't be so lost. Lucky Susie knows what's going on. 10 minutes later both Ginny and him were in fatigues. He didn't like them, but there it would be easier to carry what they may need. Susie handed each of the a gum, a 9mm Ruger, and to Ginny, she also handed a couple of compression grenades. They looked like they were on the way into a battle, Berly thought. In his head he heard Terry, my little G.I. Joe super soldier, and she laughed at him, knowing he didn't like the fatigue. Little maybe, super don't think so. He turned to Steve, you ready to warm this baby up? Susie has started the mercury rotating, are you going to pass through it? We are not passing through the way it's done with the mirror. The rotating mercury will act like the mirror in a way. He pointed to a spot above it all and said, do you see that? Steve looked up and could see some kind of black box, mounted on an overhead crane. He nodded his head. Well, that is an argon laser, and a sound generator. When we are on the bridge and the mercury is rotating at the right speed, we add the sound to open the bridge, then the laser will be diffused around us and it should allow us to just step out into the other dimension. Now that is really a simple explanation. Susie knows how this stuff is set up. She smiled up at him, no worries, I just hope that watch of yours works. I would hate to miss bringing you back. Berly put his watch to his ear, to see if it was still clicking. He had on an old wind-up one. He nodded his head, all good. He looked at the time, it's time, we need to go before the guards show up. A few minutes later, Berly and Ginny were standing over the spinning pool of mercury. Ginny slipped her arm in his. Bet this is what a tornado looks like from above. There was a vortex in the middle. He waved his hand at Susie, who pushed a switch on the control desk. The black box came to life, with a sound that sounded nothing like his music. Just like the mirror, the surface of the mercury began to change. It was the same room that they had seen before, and it was empty. Are you ready, my dear? He asks Ginny. She nodded her head, and he smiled, knowing that she was just as scared as he was about doing this. After all his work they could just be testing a new way of committing suicide. He turned to her and gave her a long kiss, which shocked Steve and Susie. He gives Susie the thumbs up, she flicked the switch. They both closed their eyes to the bright flash of green light, and when they opened their eyes again, they were in the other room. Berly pulled Ginny out of the light and it was gone. The room was like any room in his home. The air was good, but they had already known that when they had seen Hamilton walking around a few months ago. He didn't see any differences in the air or the gravity. The room was made for people like them to pass over to, or the occupants of this dimension were not much different than them, he thought. The first thing he did was activate Terry again, by putting his thumbs and index fingers together, and thought, Terry, I'm here, but I'm no longer hooked to the net. She told him. No worries, as long as you're okay. He turned to Ginny. Terry's fine, he whispered, not wanting to be heard. He pointed to the window and walked over to it. The moving mass of people, or beasts that they had seen from the drone, that they had sent in was not as big now. It was still a large amount anyways, too bad they were too high up to make out just what they were. The huge structure was a mirror for sure. They were not sure that it was the first time they saw it, but had thought it was. It didn't look like it would be long before the work was done. The big question was, where were they going? Was it really an invasion of some kind, or was it a migration or colonization? Well, to him that was not his first concern at the moment. They were there to find his friend. They had no clue where they were. They had no idea where the only door in the room went. Ginny had her gun in hand, and waved for him to follow, as she went to the door. She listened for a moment, then slowly opened it up, and peeked out. It opened into a hallway, with a few other doors. There were brass plates with words. They had no clue what the words said, but each was different. The hall turned to the left, and they were surprised at how long it was. They could not see the other end. It could have gone for miles, Berly thought. Not miles, but maybe about a mile, I would guess, Terry told him. Ginny stared at him, not sure what she should do. He nodded his head down the hall, so she moved slowly that way. They went all the way down the hall. It ended in a door, and Terry was right, it was a mile. Berly asked her how she had known that. Simple, the noise you were making took 10 seconds there and back. 10 seconds equals 1 mile. Have you noticed any sign that there has been anyone around here lately? No, my infrared is showing no signs of heat anywhere. It's been days since anyone has been here. He turned to Ginny. Terry says no one has been here in some time, so I guess this is a safe place to take a short rest. Do we try the door at this end, or should we go back and try a few of the other doors? She looked back down the long hallway, hoping he didn't want to backtrack too far. She sat down and laid her gun on the floor next to her. It would stand to reason that this door, he pointed at the door at the end of the hall, would be a stairway if there is one. We have no clue how high we are, but I'm sure there are over 100 floors below us. He sat down across from her. In his head, he thought, you have any ideas of how we may find Hamilton? When researching him, I was able to find a few videos of him talking, so having heard him I will be able to recognize his voice. I'm able to see, hear, and smell a little more than what your mind is able to. Other than that, I'm sorry to say I'll be of little help. They sat there for 10 minutes and found he was right when they opened the door. It was a stairway that went up and down to his surprise. Over the door was a stencil, and Terry told him it was the floor number and she will know it when they return this way. Her infrared told her that there had been some tracks going up and down, but they were from a few days ago. So that would mean that most likely there was no one on the floors above them, Berly thought. So he decided it best to head down. They stopped at each floor, and he would slowly open each door, so Terry could listen. They went down 9 floors before Terry could see that the doorway had been used only a couple of hours ago. He stood there holding the door open, and he could even hear something but was unable to tell what. He closed the door and motioned Ginny back up the stairs. In his head, he heard, what I smelled, I don't believe was human, but I did hear a human voice and believe it was female. Maybe it was Tina's voice, he thought. He informed Ginny what Terry had told him. She looked at him and smiled. Well, maybe Hamilton is not far from her. I think we should stay here and see who comes out that door. If she comes out, we can try to rescue her. If he's not with her, she may know where he is. He was not sure how smart this was, but he didn't want to search the whole building. He was just too old for that. He pulled his gun out. Hope we don't have to wait too long for something to happen. It turned out that they did have to wait. It was a good 3 hours before they heard a door open a couple of floors down. Ginny motioned him back behind her and she took a peek down. She heard the door on the floor below them open and she moved to try to see them, but she was too slow and all she saw was the door shut. She moved back up to where Berly was, and whispered, "They moved too fast to see who or what it was. No matter what, the next person or thing that comes out of that door, or wants in, we are taking them." He held up his gun. "I just hope they know this is a weapon." He smiled, and it made her also. After only 30 minutes or so, they heard what sounded like a couple of people coming up the stairs, so before they could reach the door Berly and Ginny came down fast pointing their guns. What happened next could have been comical but it could also have been fatal. Hamilton was there, but dressed in a robe, not the suit he had been wearing when he came there. On each side of him were beings that looked to be a cross of human and a cat of some kind. They had fur over their bodies, but they didn't have paws. Instead, they had near human hands. They also were in robes, and the shorter one was carrying a clipboard, in shock at seeing Berly and Ginny drop it on the floor. The noise was so loud, it scared Berly, who was standing 2 steps higher than Ginny. In shock, he pulled the trigger. The bullet whizzed past Ginny's left ear, and hit the floor between Hamilton and the shorter creature, ricocheting into the wall behind them. The creature's hands went to its mouth and it let out an unpleasant sound and cat-like jumped over the railing. Berly, seeing this, dropped his gun. It hit the step he was on, bounced, hit the step Ginny was on, and went off. Lucky, this time it went up into the bottom of the floor above. Pieces of it showered them. "Hell of a rescue attempt you have going, Berly," Hamilton said, smiling. The cat thing next to him made a snickering sound. Ginny, with the hand holding her gun, covered her ear and pointed at where the short cat thing had jumped, with a worried look on her face. Hamilton looked that way and then said, "That's Heather 6. She's fine, she will be back soon." He smiled big. "She's a big scaredy cat." The one next to him nodded its head. Both Berly and Ginny were at a loss as to what to say. He just stood there staring at Hamilton, with his mouth open. Hamilton waved his hand at the cat thing and said, "This is Patrick 430, and he is my friend, as Heather is. Their speech is telepathic and he is asking for permission to talk to you." They both nodded. In their heads they heard, "Welcome," and it ended in a loud hiss. "Is infected with evil tech." Patrick pointed at Berly. In Berly's head, "I'm evil tech," Terry said. Hamilton looked from Patrick to Berly. "What's he talking about?" he said, then added, "Wait, let's go to where we can sit down." "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked Ginny, who nodded her head yes, still rubbing her ear. He led them down a floor, and took them into a room where there was a table. All 4 of them sat down. The whole time Patrick's eyes never left Berly. This made him feel strange. He leaned towards Hamilton. "Why have I offended him?" he asked. He was not too sure what sex the thing was. "You mean not including you, almost shooting us?" He turned to look at Patrick. "I'm sorry, you do understand what a shock it was to see you, right?" Patrick's glare never changed. Hamilton looked at Patrick after a moment, looked back at Berly. "He says that there's more in your head than just you." Berly tilted his head, not sure what he meant. Then in his head, "They mean me," Terry said. He looked up at Hamilton. "Oh, yes, much has happened since you have been here." He turned to Ginny, who was sitting there with big eyes. "This is my secretary Ginny Bellamy, and we both work for the ACO now." Hamilton looked at each of them, then at Berly. "So is there an alien in there with you?" He smiled. "You have no choice but to tell him," Terry told him. "Like I said, a lot has happened since you have been here." He spent the next hour telling them about Steve, Susie, and Terry. Hamilton shook his head a couple of times. "It was my first day at the ACO when Tina joined you," Ginny added as Berly stopped talking. "By the way, where is she?" "She's fine, she's on the floor above us right now, and will join us soon." "Berly, why did you allow them to put an AI in your head?" Unlike what Patrick may think, Terry is no more evil than you. He gave Patrick a look he hoped was convincing. The shifters, as they call themselves, he pointed his thumb at Patrick, are not going to invade the Earth, and me being here, I'm sorry to say was my own fault. The ACO got the mirror at a sighting, a few years back. When I figured out it was kind of like a TV, I would spend hours watching different places. I had no clue it was a bridge. It would seem that the shifters had sent out robotic ships with hundreds of them to any planet they thought may one day have life. The mirrors are so they could warn the population of the evil tech. Patrick had a smile or what passed as one on his hairy face. Berly wondered if his whole race was just as proud as he was. The evil tech he was talking about, as I'm sure you know, is the AI you call Terry. You see, in the past the race of shifters had their time in history where they too had AI working for them, then with them, in the end, they tried to take over their home world. Their race was almost eradicated, and they just escaped by learning to dimensional shift. They have been on the run since. Wow, I can see why they may think I'm evil. Berly heard and wondered if Patrick was able to hear her too. He wished that he could let Hamilton hear her, then he would know that she was fine and not a threat to anyone. So this still doesn't tell me why you are still here, and did not come back if you were not a prisoner. Why, Jeffrey, would you pass up the chance to slip between the dimensions with a master race of furry friends? He laughed. You, Steve, and Susie are the only ones that would miss me, and I have Tina with me, thanks to you. So you're telling me that you don't intend to return with us? And I'm sure Tina will say the same thing. He smiled. I'm sure that Steve will understand this. Berly shook his head. You have no clue what we have done to get here. This is not a sanctioned mission, and Steve can't admit that he knows or he would be fired. It took me this long to find a way to get here when we were ordered to box up the mirror. Hamilton looked hard at him. What do you mean? You didn't use the mirror. Well, no, and yes. I made my own, and even if I do say so myself, it works a lot better than theirs. He pointed at Patrick. I can set it to go anywhere given time. For the next 2 hours, Patrick asked questions by way of Hamilton, then Berly finally looked at Patrick and said, that's it, any more it comes from you or I'm not answering. Terry is not evil, and I'm sorry for what is happening to your race. Just then the door opened, and in walked Tina, and Heather 6. Tina walked over to Hamilton and gave him a kiss on top of his head, and smiled. Berly was surprised. He had never seen her smile like that before. You two are looking good, and we do appreciate what you have done to reach us. Just like Patrick, Heather had a look of uneasiness on her face. For the second time Berly heard Patrick's voice in his head, can you shut that thing down? If you're talking about Terry, the answer is yes. He had Terry shut down and thought, okay, she's off. He knew by the look on the others' faces they were hearing him too. If your race doesn't deal with the AI now, it will, as with us, be the downfall, and you will be wiped out or on the run as we are. You can ask my friends Hamilton and Tina if I think true, they have seen our history. Both of them nodded their heads. We have no want to bring your world into our battle we are still waging with the evil tech. We cannot let them find your tech, but I'm not sure that would stop what we know will come of your use of it. Heather spoke up, we want to learn how you made the bridge work, it takes us a lifetime to build a big one. We can help your world in many ways if you will help us. She smiled at them. They spent some time talking or really thinking to each other, and in the end they came to an agreement, but Berly said that it was up to the president, and that was all there was to it, and Hamilton had to be there. Look, Jeffrey, I'm not going back with you, he said out loud. Berly's mouth fell out. What? Do you understand what I did to get here? He could believe that he would not ever come back to save him from the trouble that he was in for trying to save them. You know as well as I, if I go back there, they will never let me come back here. I'll not take the chance. If they don't believe me, then what? We will be lucky not to end up in jail for treason or something. One just doesn't go and ignore orders from the president. Berly was not happy at all. Berly looked at his watch. They had already missed the first check that Steve was to do, and the second was due any minute now. He was unable to talk any of them into returning with them as proof. If Patrick would join them, it would be no big deal, they would believe them, but then they may not let him go home again. He was not sure how this was all going to work. I'm shutting down now, Terry said. Hold on, I want to know something before you do. When you are shut down, do you dream? I'm not sure of the question. If you mean dream as a human, do know, but I do in a way see visions. They are flashes of different people and places. The funny thing is I'm not inside your head. I have my own body. He said thank you and she shut down. There was more to her than just being an AI, he thought. He had not told her what the shifters want to trade for his bridge tech. They had a program that would wipe out all the AIs and they were eager to put an end to mankind's evil tech. He turned to Ginny, I can't do it, or I won't do it. He almost yelled. Ginny grabbed him and they kissed. She smiled at him, I know, and that's one of the reasons I love you. Well, there's no telling what will happen, but as far as Annie is concerned, we never found anyone here. Hamilton and Tina are still lost. He hoped he could convince Carrie not to say anything. He wondered how hard it might be to get her to lie, then he remembered after all she was at first programmed by humans. Just then the room lit with the green light from Berly's bridge and they both stepped through smiling.